Welcome to the Here's Waldo podcast, where we sit down with top visionaries and creatives in the video game industry. Together, we'll unravel their journeys and learn more about the path they're forging ahead. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hi, I'm Lizzie Mintis, founder and CEO of Here's Waldo Recruiting, a boutique video game recruitment firm. This is the Here's Waldo podcast. In every episode, we dive deep into conversations with creatives, founders, and executives about what it takes to be successful. You can expect to hear valuable lessons from their journey and get a glimpse into the future of the industry. This episode is brought to you by Here's Waldo Recruiting, a boutique recruitment firm for the game industry. We value quality over quantity, transparency, communication, and diversity. We partner with companies, creatives, and programmers to understand the why behind their needs. We provide a white glove experience that ensures a win-win outcome. Today, we have Chris Zimmerman with us. Chris started the video game studio Sucker Punch with some friends in 1997. These are Chris's words. Somewhat miraculously, they're still at it 26 years later with 3 Sly Cooper games, 3 infamous games, and the samurai open world game, Ghost of Tsushima, to show for it. Let's get started. Thanks for your humor and self-deprecating introduction, Chris. I want to start at the beginning of your career and work our way up. So you joined Microsoft in 1988, and did they recruit you out of college? How did you?
They did. Yeah, I got interviewed. I did undergrad at Princeton, and they came on campus and interviewed. So God, that was a lot. Like anyone that's listening to your podcast can completely do the math and figure out how old I am at this point. And the answer is very old. And yeah, 1987, I suppose I got interviewed on campus by Microsoft, flew out to Seattle to do an interview and decided that was the job I wanted. So I've been out here ever since.
How big was the company then? What was the state of
Microsoft? It was like 2,000 people when I started. It was crazy. Like I was there during the craziest part of Microsoft, right? Where it was like, I don't know, I was like employee 2,500 or so maybe. And when I left 9 years later, it was 25,000. So
wow.
Like 10 times as many people. It was crazy. It was like, it was fun. I don't think people don't have an idea of how disruptive and how innovative Microsoft was at that point, and how different it was than the other big video or big computer software companies. Anything from hiring practices to the way work was organized to the ambition of the teams was all really. Now people have this idea of Microsoft being this, relatively staid and conservative giant, right? But when I joined, it was not that at all. It was just a bunch of relatively young people trying to change the world, and it was neat. It was really fun. I talked to other companies when I was recruiting that were more, traditional. They've been around for a while. Companies like HP or Bell Labs or whatever. Microsoft at that point had a real kind of aggressive startup mentality. So it was a really fun place to work. At the beginning of my career, there was room for me to go off and do really cool things. That maybe wouldn't have been there if I'd been at a company that was more established and didn't have this sort of like explosive hyper growth where, there were so many new people all the time that, after 3 or 4 years, I was an old timer. It was a neat environment to learn how to be a professional software developer in.
How did you deal with all of that growth, and how did you ingest 22,000 people over the time you were there? And still managed to do well.
It was, I didn't know any different, right? I mean, that was the only environment I'd ever known. I mean, I had jobs before, but not like a big, official tech company job. So I just assumed that's the way that they all work. I mean, I kind of knew they weren't, right? But I would tell, I think at my first kind of company meeting at Microsoft, there was, there were like questions from the audience for whoever was on stage, Bill Gates or whoever. And one of the questions was someone got upset because they were required to wear shoes in the hallway. So I told people the story. Like when on my first day of work, I was talking to my mom, and she was like, "Oh, Chris, what are you going to wear to your first day of work?" And I was like, "Tennis shoes." And she's like, "No, Chris, you have to wear grown-up clothes." You're going to a job now. And I was like, no, Mom, you haven't been there. I will wear penny loafers tomorrow. I will dress like a grown-up tomorrow. But that was only one day, because after that, it's, tennis shoes and hoodies the Mark Zuckerberg proto fashion approach there in 1988. So anyhow, it's a crazy time. You look back and you're like, oh my God, it was so long ago, and things were so different. So
what do you think was your biggest learning from your time at Microsoft, or learnings?
oh, wow. That's tough. I mean, a lot of it is, I think a lot of people, your first couple of years at a job are can be pretty formative, right? Where it's your first time working in that sort of environment. And so that transition from what's ultimately a social environment when you're in school or maybe a part-time job to a professional environment takes some adjustment. So like I had to, I think there was I was 22, right? My brain wasn't fully formed. So
Yes.
like understanding, I think, or appreciating the difference between the way I perceive myself and the way other people around me perceive me. You're not really forced to confront that when you're in college, but when you're locked in a room with people working on something, 40 hours a week, you have to fix these things, right? You can't just not hang out with the people that you're not getting along with. And for me, that meant kind of understanding and tempering some of the things I was doing, or the ways I was approaching things, the ways I would talk about things. My intentions might have been good, but it wasn't being perceived as in the way that I wanted it to be. So I had to be a little bit careful about that, or be a little bit more aware of how I was working with other people in a way that I didn't when I was in college. So that was a big one. That was kind of personal growth thing, right? Like you learn a lot about how to define a project, or ways in which you can fail. When I was at Microsoft, because my time at Microsoft was really rewarding and interesting, but it didn't result in a lot of successful products, right? I was drawn to working on things that were more aggressive, more ambitious, less, version N+1 of something that the company had done before. Microsoft isn't really great at that. Wasn't at the time I was there. Isn't really now. They're great at, especially when I was there, doing the second version or the third version of something. The first version's harder. It's a different sort of problem. But that's the sort of problems I liked solving. So I was always drawn to those projects, and kind of swimming upstream a little bit in Microsoft culture, which is, I'm sure it's changed in the 25 years since I've been gone, right? But it was a little bit of an uphill climb to try to get new interesting things done. And so, it was only marginally successful. But in the process, you kind of see why that was hard for Microsoft, and why Microsoft's culture, which at that point was very argumentative, argumentative consensus, right? Where it's like the core concept of Microsoft at that point was that it was very engineering driven at that point, less so now. The concept at that point was, well, we're just going to get a bunch of smart people in the room, and they'll discuss the problems and the issues, and the consensus will form, and that's what we'll go do. And that can work, but only if there is a consensus that forms. If there isn't, it's pretty tough. It's hard to do things that are different where there's not an obvious answer. Like if you're doing, at that point, the second version of Word for Windows, right? It's like, well, you've got a ton of customer data you can build on, right? It's pretty easy to look at that and say, okay, well, here are the things that people want that we don't have, or things that people are confused by. Let's go fix them. But if you're doing version 1 of something, there isn't that, right? There maybe isn't even an obvious market for what you think you want to build. You're just kind of guessing. It's hard to do that in a kind of an engineering consensus organization, because there's no evidence, right? And so it was tough. It was tough to do really brand new things. So that was a little bit frustrating for me.
So you were at Microsoft, and then what led you to start Sucker Punch? Talk to me about that journey.
I'd grown frustrated with Microsoft. My role at Microsoft was trying to, at that point, my maybe self-appointed role at Microsoft was trying to make interesting things happen, right? And Microsoft's culture at the time being this sort of collaborative thing, well, the stuff I was interested in tended to span groups. And that meant a lot of time working across group boundaries to try to drive a consensus on something. And honestly, it's hurting cats, right? Where it's like, you've got to get everybody to agree that this is the right thing for us to be doing next. And even after you develop that consensus, you have to maintain the consensus afterwards while you're in the middle of doing this thing, right? Where everybody is just kind of like skitter after once they leave the room, right? Everybody skitters out of control. And so you're always spending all this time talking to people, trying to keep this consensus going until the thing is far enough along that it's obviously going to work, right? And oh my God, is that tiring, right? So it's just tracking people down and making sure that everyone's still on the same page. And it was tiring. And at some point, I'm like, I do not want to do that again. That was just too much work. I want to be in a canoe where everyone is rowing in the same direction. And it seemed like the easiest way to do that was just to split off and go start a company to do something. And I think the other thing that was going on, so there was this frustration with the environment and that I was kind of swimming against the current a little bit. And there was also, this was the late 90s. So this is during the kind of antitrust stuff with Microsoft, when it looked like Microsoft was going to take over the world. It was before, before there were other people of that, kind of throw weight that were also involved. And I kind of felt like I was not necessarily working for the good guys. Because I was I in meetings where we talked about extending the Windows monopoly into other products? Absolutely. So I didn't feel like I was necessarily on the right side. I was fighting for the empire at that point, right? I wanted to fight for the rebellion. And again, it felt like starting a company was a good way to do that. So we knew we wanted to start a company. I would kind of gathered some friends to do this. And it seemed like actually building games would be fun, right? So I came into the games business from a really weird angle. This sort of like, I'd grown up learning how to program by making games, right? I've been a gamer my whole life, but well, not my whole life, because video games weren't invented when I was born. But a large part of my life I was a gamer, and so there was that draw. But in some ways, the decision to make a game company was a practical one, right? We started Sucker Punch because there was this whole ecosystem to support companies like Sucker Punch at that time in the 90s, the early 2000s, where you had a lot of small independent video game developers that would build product, and then you'd find a publisher to put it on into the market. And we felt like we kind of knew how to make products, me and the other people that started Sucker Punch. And it was nice that there was somebody else who was going to take care of all the business stuff. At least that was our kind of naive idea about how the industry worked at that point. But it seemed like it made sense that the scale was about right. We could have, our first game, Rocket Robot on Wheels, we had 17 people at peak. So wow. not a big studio. But for the time, it was not small, but not a big studio. But we could still do something that was like competitive in the world marketplace for Nintendo 64 games. It was a practical decision as much as a kind of a decision driven by the emotional draw of making video games. So,
and where did your co-founders come from? Were you all from Microsoft?
Oh, Microsoft. Yeah. So
right? None of you came from games? Nobody was in the game?
Nobody. Nobody. Like we all the people that had games industry experience were hires, right? The founders were all programmers from Microsoft, because that's that was my peer group, right? So let's see, Brian Fleming, who's the studio head at Sucker Punch now, and was co-founder, was what Microsoft calls a program manager, so kind of like a technical design plus product management role. But he's also a programmer, so wasn't that different. So so 6 programmers at the very beginning, and then all the people on the creative, so what we would call the creative side, we recruited from outside. And I can't believe what any of them were thinking. I know them now. I'm still friends with them. The people that were like Karen Yamagiwa's hired employee number 1 at Sucker Punch. And I can't imagine how she managed to decide that this was actually a reasonable decision to come join these engineers that thought they were going to build a video game, but thankfully she did, and so did the people that followed her. And we kind of built that side of the company up, not from people we knew, but from people we interviewed and hired. So
you did a lot of recruiting from outside of your network.
yeah, absolutely, had to be, right?
Well, were they adjacent? How did you even find her? Was it somebody knew?
Oh man, I don't even remember. I'd have to talk to Karen. I don't know how that contact was made. How did we run? Maybe it was friends of friends, because she had been working as a contractor on something that Microsoft's games division was called at that point. So she had been working on a contractor on a Microsoft project. So maybe it was handshake stuff. So Kama Sutra was pretty good even at that point. And so for the first decade or so of our existence, we would just put ads up on Kama Sutra and deal with people coming in over the transom, we would say, seeing an ad on our website or responding to an ad on Kama Sutra or, one of the other places. But Kama Sutra is the one where we actually found people. We did use some external recruiters for, the first decade or so. Occasionally somebody would come in there. But kind of dribbled in. It was harder at the very beginning, right? When we hadn't actually shipped a game yet. Like, how do you get people to notice you? And how do you get them to say yes when you decide there's someone you want to hire? It got easier once we had games out, or once we had popular games out, it got a lot easier, right? But even the first game, even a game that was out that people generally hadn't played because there were like 100,000 copies of Rocket sold, it still helped a lot. So at least it was clear that we were going to get something done. So, but yeah, it was because we didn't know how to. I mean, the thing about it is that, like, we were programmers. I knew how to hire programmers. I've been doing that for 10 years, right? But like, how do you hire a concept artist, right? Like, we don't know, right? You're just kind of making it up as you go, kind of it's a you're building a ladder out of your own kind of failures, right? Of like failing to understand what's important about the position or what the positions even are, right? And failing to understand what you need in this position, right? Because not every company works differently. Every organization has a different way of working, different philosophy of how to get things done. And unless it's not just enough for the person to be really good at what they do, they have to also be a good fit for your kind of way of doing things. And that's not, I don't think we even understood that to begin with, right? Because all of us have been at Microsoft for 10 years, and we were just used to that environment. That was the environment we knew. And it took years, I think, to get enough distance to understand all the things we were assuming that other people weren't going to assume about how companies should work, and how we needed to adjust our way of thinking about recruiting and managing and running a company to deal with the fact that it wasn't Microsoft anymore. The people were different, the products were different, the environment was different. It was just, but you don't know, right? It's like there's a saying of, I don't know who discovered water, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't a fish, right? So when you're in the middle of it, you don't even perceive it. It's only when you get a little bit of distance that you can see what was interesting or what was different about the environment. And then you're like, oh, well, now we're going to have to, adjust how we do things to match.
Yeah, that's such a common struggle that I think founders that come from a big company go through, because I see it all the time when I'm trying to hire for them. It's like, yes, at Google, at this company, here's how we hired, and I'd like to find the same people that I found at Google. But the person that worked for you at Google or Microsoft may not be the right person for your startup, because it's such
yeah, absolutely. It's and it took us a while to figure that out, right? And to start finding the people that we wanted to find. But you kind of build on failures of having people that are good people and good at what they do, but just aren't a good fit for you in terms of what you expected. Like, let me give you an example, because I keep saying these things. I'm not actually giving concrete examples. So one of the things that culturally was very true about Sucker Punch early on, and is still true to some extent, is that we give people a ton of autonomy, but there's also responsibility that comes along with that, right? So there is not generally, no matter who you are in the organization, someone looking over your shoulder at what you're doing. No one is managing you that closely. You just have goals and objectives, and you're expected to figure out what you need to do to meet those. And that's true for, junior programmers or environment artists, all the way up to, people that are running, a whole discipline at Sucker Punch. And that is a great environment for some people where they thrive in that sort of environment, where they're just expected to figure out what needs to get done and do it. And maybe that's not even what their manager thinks they should be doing. They're still expected to figure that out and make it happen. And just not great at all for some people. Some people just really aren't comfortable in that environment, right? And that there's nothing wrong with being happier if you have a list of tasks you need to march through. That for some people, that's very safe feeling, right? That I've got a list of 10 things to do this week, and if I do them, then it's a successful week, right? And for a lot of Sucker Punch, that's just not the way we work. Like there is no list of 10 things. If there is, it's because you created it, right? And you'll be supported, and your mistakes will be accepted, but you can't. You're expected to figure out what it is that you should be doing every day, and that's just not a good fit for some people. And I don't know that we've always, I don't think even now we're necessarily that great at interviewing for that, because it's a hard thing to interview for, right? You can't ask people, do you want more autonomy? It's like everybody says, absolutely, right? But it turns out that, maybe not. Maybe that isn't going to be a good fit for every single person that we interview, even if they're super good at whatever their discipline is. The cultural fit might not be there. So, and I think it's also like a thing where, like, if you're figuring out how to run an organization, it's really hard not to build on your own experience, right? To not build the organization that you think you would like, right, or that would have been good for you. And it took a while, I think, for me, even having been at Microsoft for 10 years ish, to understand that other people didn't think like me, which is kind of crazy. Like if you know me, you're like, oh, Chris, yeah, you're an idiot if you didn't think that. Nobody thinks like you, Chris. But I didn't realize that, right? Because I was surrounded by people that were pretty much like me, right? And I would be like, oh yeah, well, I have creative people that I work with. I work with graphic designers, and I work with it's like, no, kind of, right? But they are the most technical graphic designer in the world, right? They are a programmer, really. It's just that you don't think of them as a programmer. They really are. Any normal person would think of this person as being super technical. They just happen to be a graphic designer who's super, super technical, right? And now we were at Sucker Punch, that wasn't the case anymore, right? People weren't super technical. And so the things that I wanted, like when I'm looking at like our performance review process or whatever, I'm like, oh, that would have been great when I was getting reviewed. For people at Sucker Punch, they're like, this is just making me weird. They're like numbers and stuff. Like, why are there numbers here? I don't like this, right? And you're like, but I thought this was going to be good for you, but it wasn't, right? So, and you're like, well, that was not what I wanted or expected. And you have to, so it's like we had to do that like early on. Like the first time we did performance reviews for people, we kind of did a Microsoft style. And it turns out that, well, a performance review system that's built by engineers for engineers does not work for someone who, can't do the math in their head, right? It's just not a good fit. And so like that was like, we had to take a big step back then and rethink our whole idea about like, how does the performance review process work, right? And why does it work that way? Because that's the other thing, right? We talked earlier about how when you're at a big company, you kind of like get used to it and you don't really think about, well, why is it the way it is, right? Like, why are things designed this way? And are we in the same situation we were in when we were in a 25,000 person company? The answer is no, we are not, right? And our goals are different, right? Our goals, what our performance review process evolved into was it evolved away from thinking of performance review as a way of evaluating people's performance. Where, if you're at a big company, you need some way of knowing, okay, well, who are the people who are high performers in the organization? Who are the people that are struggling? How do we make these sorts of evaluations when we have 25,000 people that we need to make this decision for, right? How do you compare between groups? Like, how do you, because it does sometimes happen that one like 4-person group, they're all high performers. But it turns out that every manager thinks their team is full of high performers. And how do you sort that out, right? You have this very hard problem to solve. And it took us a while to realize we didn't have that problem, right? We knew every single person at the company. We did not have a problem of figuring out who was doing well. We knew. What we had was a situation where we wanted to help people grow, right? We had a personal development problem, not a performance evaluation problem. And we kind of it took us a while to figure this out and to actually put it into practice, but we effectively pivoted our annual performance review process away from being an evaluation process and into being a personal development process. And so that means that you make a lot of changes at that point, right? You're like, okay, well, if we want this to be about personal growth, an opportunity for personal growth, how do we change things? And it means that our process becomes a lot more kind of driven by the person being reviewed, right? Because if they don't buy in, nothing's going to change, right? Like if they don't think, okay, well, there is this thing that I could do differently, or maybe an aspect of what I'm doing that I can build on. If they don't buy in, nothing's going to change. And so switching it around, so instead of having it be manager driven, it's employee driven, or reviewer reviewed, switching around who's in charge really changes the dynamic of it. And getting rid of all the numbers, because that's not helping, right? Like, how is that helping me grow as an animator, right? Having a number, that's not helping. Like, tell me what I'm doing well so I can do more of it. Tell me what I'm struggling at, or what people think I'm struggling at, so I can improve at it. We also now done some for a long time on the programming side, and we a lot of our performance, our annual process is built on 360-degree feedback, right? So we get feedback on everybody from everybody they're working with, and then that forms like the biggest part of the review. It's not just how your manager thinks about you; it's how your peers think about you, right? That ends up being a lot easier way to take feedback, right? Where, like, because I've done lots of management meetings, right? Where if I say, look, you're not doing a good job at this thing, that can put people into a really defensive posture pretty quickly. Even if they know it's true, it's still hard to, not go into a defensive crouch right away. But if the way it's framed is, well, here's what your peers are saying about the way you're working, that actually ends up being a lot easier for people to take. It depersonalizes it a little bit. It's not just, the person you're talking to. It's not just your manager and you. Your manager kind of is your coach at that point, right? It's like someone who's helping you along your journey. And when our process works well, that's the way it feels, right? That the person giving your review is helping you grow, right? They want you to succeed, and they're trying to figure out how to help you succeed. They're not an antagonist, right? They're on your side. And that makes it a lot easier to, I think, work together, again, when it works, to work together to find things that you can do better as an employee to be more effective, which I think was generally people's goal, is to be more effective at what they do. So,
I mean, nobody comes to work to do a bad job. Somebody
No,
told me lately, it's true, right? Everyone wants to do
absolutely.
it. They want you to understand what a good job is. And I like that about, that was one of my biggest learnings in my business too. I'm an intense person, and I like to get stuff done.
Mm-hmm.
But not everybody functions that way. And I would say I'm impatient. I like stuff to happen.
Yeah.
And so if I were in somebody's shoes, I would want all these things to happen. But some people are very on just a different path. They want things to happen in a different way than I would. And so you definitely can't put your own expectations of what would be good
Yeah.
for you on
Well,
top.
and I think it's as a manager, as an organizational head, right? You have to decide, well, what am I going to change about myself, or what am I going to accept, um, that we're not going to work exactly the way I want to work because it just doesn't work for other people, and what are you going to draw the line at, right? So like, what are you going to where what are the core principles that you're going to run the company on,
That's the
right?
most important thing. Then you can interview and
Yeah,
review
yeah.
on those. Right. And if you
Well,
don't have those, you're
yeah, it's
well.
not going to work. It's not going to work. I mean, I think that's the thing is that like, in the end, your organization is going to have, whether it's a recruiting company or Sucker Punch or whatever.
Any company.
Um, yeah, any company that's like ours, right? Where it's like, I mean, there are companies where it's like people are just going to come punch the clock, right? They're just coming. It's a job. They're going to do the job. They're going to go home, right? But that's not the kind of company that we have, right? We're only going to succeed if people are really invested in the quality of the work they're doing. And that's a different sort of company, right? And guess what? If you've got a company where everybody kind of has to be bought into what you're doing, or you're not going to succeed, you have to figure out how you're going to run the company so that everybody's bought in, right? It's that's the core challenge, right? Of how do you get to the point where you understand enough about what's important about your company and your culture and how you approach building a product that you can assemble people that are going to match, right? That are going to all fit together and make up that culture, right? So for us, I think one of the things that's kind of a philosophical point at Sucker Punch is that it's all about the product. That's what we would say, that like the thing that's important is that the game experience is as good as it can be, that we're doing this for the people that are playing the games. And that might seem obvious, like, oh, I wouldn't, well, of course it's that way. But, you know, there are other laudable goals that you could have for your company, in terms of your company could be all about empowerment and personal growth for the people that work there, or it could be about addressing societal ills, right? Or um, it could be about any number of things. It could be about making as much money as possible, right? Or it could be about
Yeah.
direct business goals. And
I think
but
if your goal is just about money and you don't have the passion, at some point that becomes obvious.
I think so, but I appreciate that there are other ways of looking at this, right? That there are other ways to run a company, other things you could think were important. And I don't have enough. I don't have any data, right? They might be right. My situation, our situation, is unique to us. What's important is I think that we understand what is unique to us, so that we can talk about that with people, so they understand what it is they're buying into. Because if the culture doesn't fit, then they're not going to be happy and they're going to leave, right? I think one of the things that we rely on culturally is that we have lots of people that are sucker punchers, right? And they're going to stay. They're going to be here for a long time. And because we don't have a lot of turnover, we have a really strong core of people that have been around for a long time. That lets us run more efficiently and therefore more lean than a lot of companies that are like us do. We don't have to waste a lot of time because everybody kind of understands the basic ideas of what's important to us and how we're going to do things, right? And so we can give people a lot of autonomy. We can not have a lot of layers of management. We don't have to have lots of extra people around to fill in holes to do work that might get thrown away, because we just don't have that problem, because so many of our people have been here for 10, 15 years. It lets us run a lot more efficiently. But that then puts that's a heavy burden, right? It's like what's the success line for adding somebody new to the company? For us, it's 5 years. If they stay 5 years, we're like, yeah, that was the right decision. And that's a huge number. Like most people in the video game business, it's like, no, that's our turn. We're turning over half our staff every year. And for us, it's more like voluntary attrits, maybe a couple a year. And because we're set up that way, we can dispense with a lot of the costs that you bear if you're flipping your staff over all the time. It lets us run a lot. Like, I think one of the things that people are surprised by, knowing, Sucker Punch at this point builds these really big open world games, like 50-hour games that are big in scope, big in ambition, big in amount of content, big in number of hours to play through. So single player games, but big single player games. And people have read stories often about, well, how many people worked on GTA? Answer 2,000, right? You're like, well, that's a big number.
Redemption.
Yeah. And for us, it's like we have 150 people. And yet we're going to build games that have that scale and ambition. And one of the reasons, there are lots of reasons why we can do that, but one of them is that we have this efficiency that comes from having this long-term, stable employee base, right? Of people that have been here and have gone through this process before and don't panic and know what the important things are to work on. And as a result, there's not a lot of wasted effort. What we work on tends to end up on screen, more so than when you have the inefficiencies of working with 1,000 people, 500 of whom have never worked on this project or with this team before. So part of the secret sauce, I think.
How have you been able to retain people for 10 to 15 years? That is so impressive.
Yeah.
A lot of people love
not everybody does, right? I mean, I think that's just the way the statistics work out, right? If people aren't happy and leave, that's sad, right? It's unfortunate, but it's often, I think, for the better. And maybe that's self-serving, right? But I think that someone's here and they're not a good fit and it's not working out, it's not good for them, right? They're not happy. Nobody wants to be in a situation where they feel like they're underperforming or they're struggling or they're, a square in a round hole. Everyone, I think, especially the people we hire, because like we have people that don't work out, where they're unhappy with how the company works most commonly, but sometimes we're unhappy with how they're fitting, but it's more often that people realize that themselves and they know they're unhappy. Like everybody that we hire is really good at what they do. It's like none of them have a problem going and finding a job somewhere else. Like our bar is incredibly high. So if they do, they're happy, or it's kind of everybody wins at that point, right? So I think that's the thing, is that we really do want people to stick around a long time because it helps us do things. But if we don't want people to stick around if they're not happy, right? Like if someone's unhappy, they should go do something else, right? And sometimes those people, for a variety of reasons, we have, I don't know, half dozen people here at Sucker Punch now that for one reason or another decided they wanted to do something different, went away, did something different for a while, and then we're like, oh no, actually, I was missing. I was missing. I'll come back, right? I'm like, yeah, you can come back. That's fine. We don't mind. The door is never shut. Once you've demonstrated your worth, that you fit here, if you go away, you can come back. We'll take you back. So you might lose some of your profit sharing in the process, but it's your call, man. So, but I mean, and a lot of people leave and are happy that they've left, and I'm happy for them. So it's fine. But you do have to find, and that's why that match is hard to find, right? Like I think that's the thing that's super weird about recruiting or the interviewing process, is that you're making this incredibly important decision based on almost no information, right? Like you walk into an interview with a company and how much do you know, right? Like how much do you really know? Like maybe you've done an assessment ahead of time, maybe you've done a phone interview, and you come into an office, or don't even come into an office now, you do virtually, right? You're doing over Zoom. Yeah, you're doing like 5 Zoom calls, and then you're like, okay, at the end of this, you're gonna have to decide where you're gonna spend the next 10 years, 40 hours a week, 10 years, right? And you're like, well, what? That is like the craziest thing possible, right? It's like it's like 90 Day Bride, right? It's like you're making this huge decision based on almost no information. And guess what? Everyone's being super cheery and positive about everything the whole time on both sides, and yet you're still going to try to make this huge decision. Like, how do you cut through that, right? How do you actually figure out whether this person's going to be effective and they're going to be a fit from our side, and then from their side, like because that's what I tell people when they come interview. At I will say, look, this is as much about you evaluating us as it is about us evaluating you, right? Because if both directions don't work, this isn't going to work, right? Like if you're here and unhappy for 9 months and then leave, we've wasted everybody's time. You haven't gotten anything done in 9 months. You're still figuring out how, where the pencils are, right? It's going to take a while for you to get up to speed, and we have to figure out how to make it work both ways, and that's tough, right? Like how do you design your very limited interview day so that the person you're talking to gets the information they need to make this super important life decision, right? How do you do that? At the same time, you're gathering information about whether you think they're going to be a fit, whether they're up to the disciplinary bar that you have, and whether they're a cultural fit, whether they're a personality fit. Like it's a super tough thing to do. It's amazing that you ever get it right. So, when you have things, I don't know. So you have to, I don't know. It's tough. Like it's like one of the core problems. So
what's the answer? What have you found to be the most effective way to discern that somebody is going to be a 15-year or at least a 5-year? That's your minimum.
Yeah, 5-year minimum, right? I think it's easier for some disciplines than for others, at least based on because I think you have to be introspective, and for us, where we can, data driven. Like you have to look at your understanding that recruiting and staffing for a company like Sucker Punch is one of your core functions, right? It's not like we build games. Actually, you got to think of it as we hire people to make games, right? But this is a core part of your value add as a company, is assembling the team. Like you have to be as serious about it as you are about anything you do, right? Like, and I think that's not something most people do. I think that if you talk to like the people that are, the art director or the animation director, they tend to be focused on what they think of as making the game, right? Of reviewing content or talking about direction or putting together vision boards or whatever. And they underinvest in the things they need to be doing to help build their team, right? They just expect that the team is there, right? But it isn't. They're part of making it, growing it, maintaining it. And I think people underinvest in it. And so part of it is making sure that the people that are going to be making, your hiring managers, effectively, the people that are going to be making the decisions about who to invite onto the team, are actually engaged and invested in the process. And it's especially, I think, if you're on the recruiting side of things, if you're like Sonia Jackson, who does our recruiting here internally, like understanding how to help people see that, right? And understanding that their ability to focus on that may wax and wane over the course of the product. And so if you're at a point where they actually probably should have the bandwidth to focus on recruiting, that you take that opportunity to get them to focus on it. So I think there's this sort of like making sure that you, at the kind of upper management level or the mid-management level and up in your company, that there is a realization that recruiting and team management is a core part of your function. Not something that you also do. It is a core part of what you do. I think that is part of what you need to do to be successful. I think then you also need to look discipline by discipline at your process for sourcing, evaluating, onboarding, managing people, and treat it like you would the game you're building. For us, right? You have to be as serious about it. Like if we'll do focus tests of our game. We do them all the time. We do them internally throughout the whole process. We've done external focus tests on the game we're working on now. And that's a important part of our process, right? To actually look at what you've built and evaluate it. Well, you've got to be doing if recruiting and onboarding and all that stuff is as important to you in the long term as building your game. Well, you should be doing the same things there, right? So how do you look at what you've done? How do you gather data about all the parts of this funnel that results in the tenure employee? How do you evaluate what you've done? How do you even think about what you've done so that you can improve your process, right? Because if you're not improving that kind of human part of your process of building your team, you're being dumb, right? Like it's a core part of your company. Like how can you not try to be getting better at it, right? And so we do try to do that, right? Maybe not as much as we should. I think we're as guilty as anyone else is just getting focused on the day-to-day of building the game and losing track of the year-to-year of building the company. But we at least know we're making that mistake, right? That's a step. And so it does mean looking at what, for each discipline, it's going to be a different process, right? But we're going to keep working on that process. And of trying to evaluate it against the success that we've had. So like one of the things that we do that is, controversial, but for some people it is we're for some of the things we do, we're super assessment focused. So assessment being this sort of like recruiting phrase for like programming tests and like take home projects that we would do for like someone building environments for our game. They're going to have a prompt and they'll have to do something for us offline. And for some people, that's like kind of offensive, even. Like there are people see people on the internet, and I know as a recruiter, you definitely talk to people that are like, I would never do. I cannot believe that someone have the gall to ask me to solve this intro programming problem, right? And but for us, like that is a core part of our process, and that is not something we're going to negotiate on. If you don't want to play by that set of rules, that's fine. Go play in someone else's sandbox because you're not playing in ours. And
I have a hard time with that. Like, if you want the job, I think that you should do what the job requires within reason, right?
Yeah.
But I had a post about this on LinkedIn. People sent me hate mail. People wrote me the nastiest comments that you should only have, companies should only have one interview in the interview process, which blew my mind because, like you said, you're committing to this marriage. How can you get married if you don't even know the person?
Exactly. It's like you're only hurting yourself, right? I don't know, whatever. I'm old now, right? And so with age comes at least a little bit of wisdom, and there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? I mean, it's it's fine. Like if someone has this very emotionally important, deeply held conviction that that companies should be better at evaluating people and shouldn't be asking them to do this thing that they feel is beneath them, I'm sure that works for some people. It does not work for us, and we will look at the data to find out, right? We will actually look at how we've gone through and how people have been graded through the process. And we will then correlate with that with how they do at Sucker Punch. And if that correlation is there, which it is, we're like, okay, we're not entirely wrong about how we're doing this. We might need to keep working on it, but we're not entirely wrong that the assessment is really helping us identify the people that are going to work, because the people that did really well in the assessment tend to do really well here. I mean, that's the problem with a lot of this stuff is that, we say no to everybody, right? Like, I mean, to a first approximation, the answer is no, right? Like we will, on the programming side, where I actually know the numbers, like people that get in touch with us, maybe 1 in 50 will get a job offer from us. So there are lots of stages that lead up to that. It's not like we're going to say no to 50 people that come to like a full interview cycle day here on site or remotely. But like everybody, we say no to everybody, and we say no to lots of people that just go like, well, do we say no to people that would do really well here? Absolutely, right? You can't think you're going to say no to 49 out of 50 people or 99 out of 100 people and not realize that you're throwing out some really good candidates along the way. That's not the point, right? The point is we have limited time to invest in people here. We really want them to stick when we're here. We are absolutely going to tie break in favor of saying no to someone where we're not sure, in return for most of the people that we bring through and bring in, at least from the stuff we can evaluate, are going to be able to do the job, are going to be able to work culturally, are going to be able to interact with everybody on the team positively, and are going to stick. And we can look at some, especially the assessment-driven things that we do. So like, environment art, something where we've had a lot of success hiring because we have a better process for evaluating whether the person's going to be able to do the work that we have, do it well, and it's going to fit in the team. Programming, same way. We're pretty good at evaluating programmers. The things where we struggle a little bit are the disciplines where we haven't figured out how to do assessment well enough yet. So like game design has been one of those things for us where we have lots of really good game designers, but our rate of finding those people has been lower than it is for other things. Like we fail more often. And, again, it's just bad for everybody to have a mismatch where someone doesn't like the work, doesn't really fit their skill set, doesn't like the company. That's just not, we've been able to succeed despite our relative lack of success in hiring people. We do find people that are great, but, we've gone through a lot of people where it didn't match. And I wish we were better at it. We keep trying to get better at it, but it's tough. So anyhow, we haven't cracked that nut yet. We haven't figured out how to do that one yet. So, and
I love that you have data and you look at the data of how people do in the interview and you know that it works. I talked to somebody high up at a large company who said that they do sort of a leak codey sort of assessment on the programming side, which is I find not a great way to test somebody who does not solve these problems in their actual job. And the manager told me that a few people had just knocked it out of the park, like best leak code or whatever ever. And he followed up later to see how they had done, and they were actually performing low. Because I don't think people look at that correlation or really consider it or take it that seriously. I mean, a lot of hiring managers I work with copy a job description from somebody online, and then they're like, oh, this is it. This is the environment art job description. It's like, why do you want these things, right? Why is this in your job description? Why do you need 5 years? So
right. Yeah. I think it's the, it's just tough, right? It's hard to do. It's hard to do well, but if you don't, you're going to fail in the long run, right? Like you're only as strong as the people that you have for a company like ours. So unless you're continuing to get stronger by adding new people that are strong or by helping the people within your organization grow, and sometimes by having people who aren't working out, that aren't a good fit, leaving, that, you grow all three ways. But if you don't, like we're way stronger now than we were, even 10 years ago. And it's because we're like, even though we have a lot of people that have been here a long time, we can't stand still. We have to keep growing because the challenges that we face are still growing, right? Like the expectations of customers are still growing. So we need to grow to meet those.
I want to talk about your biggest success that you feel, what you're most proud of throughout your time at Sucker Punch. And I also want to highlight what the biggest struggle has been, because I think I talked to a lot of entrepreneurs and they're like, oh, it's sunshine and rainbows, but it's not. And I think it's important to share highs, and sometimes your personal, what you think the high is isn't always what the outside world would think the high is. And I think it's important to talk about the lows, because everybody has lows and struggles, and even very successful people have them.
Yeah. I think highs are easier. I think that like one of the things about working on video games is that for me at least, it's like a personal statement. It's like important for me to feel like I'm doing something worthwhile with my time, right? I feel like I've been given lots of gifts and benefits and advantages, and it would be wrong of me on an ethical level to not take advantage of that, to not, do something worthwhile. And for a while, I kind of felt like that at Microsoft, even though the things I was doing weren't necessarily ending up in the hands of consumers.
Sure.
felt like I was doing that. At least there was a gigantic scale, right? Like if I did do something that was worthwhile, there was like hundreds of millions of people were going to use it, right? That's cool. But when we switched to doing video games, I struggled with that for years, right? Of like, is this indulgent, right? Am I is this actually my calling? Is this actually the highest and best use of me as a resource? And it was only once we got a few years in and I could start seeing the impact it was having on people's lives, the games we were making. At first it was for kids, right? But, to see that we were putting smiles on faces, right? That there was some 7-year-old out there playing Sly Cooper where that was their first love, right? That was the first game they played. That was their favorite game. And it always will be, right? And we still run into those people now, even 20 years later, where that was their first love, right? And sometimes they'll come to Sucker Punch as employees now because they're old enough to work at Sucker Punch now, and it will sometimes take some while to get around to mentioning that, but it's super heartwarming when they do, right? Where you realize that you are part of this really special moment for a kid, right? And same true as now, right? Like when we're doing the Infamous games or Ghost. These are games that were an important part of someone's life, right? For a lot of people, they're just entertainment, but for some people, it was what they needed at the time, and you know, being able to be part of that is I think the most rewarding part of the job for me is seeing that, right, where it's like, oh, like we got a shout out in the Seattle Times actually, like a couple weeks ago, where just in the gaming column, I'm reading along, I'm just reading through the newspaper because I'm old and I read the newspaper, and they're like talking about new games, and they have the section of, well, if you like this one, here's another option, and someone. The person who wrote the article gave a shout out to Infamous Second Son. It was this game we made 10 years ago, came out 2014. And they talked about what they liked about it. And it was like, wow, that's cool that like 10 years later, this had enough of an impact that this person, when they're writing about the new hot game that's coming out, it's like, well, I want to talk about this game, which I feel like is underappreciated. It was like, it's neat, right? To have that and to have, to have people come up and ask you about your jacket. If I'm wearing a Ghost, we have lots. I think I can go for an entire month just wearing black T-shirts that have a Sony logo on them, right? So I can't not do this. It's not that I'm trying to get people to come up and talk to me, but it's neat to see that, right? To have people come up and talk to you and tell you how much they liked this experience, of how much value it added to them. That's cool. That's the positive for me. I don't know if that's what you were looking for, but that's what I would say. So
I'm looking for your positive, and that's it. That is the most rewarding part of any business, when
Yeah.
you make people happy and you make a impact. Same thing for me.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's the satisfaction of seeing someone end up in exactly the right spot for you, right? It's like the flower can now bloom, right? They are in exactly the right spot. So
and they get promoted, and then they make this cool feature for the game or for the product, and that's the best.
Yeah.
Or when they, for me, the best is if they weren't going to accept the offer. I have one in particular who wasn't going to, but was, for me, not fully understanding the option. So we had a coming to Jesus about what the situation was, and I just had a lot of data. And if it's not the right fit for somebody, that's fine. Like if it's truly not the right fit, I want you to be happy. I want you to go to the job that's the right fit for you. But I was positive this person wasn't seeing everything, and they followed up with me later and were like, Lizzie, thank you for giving me all the information. I made the right decision. I'm like, yes. So,
yeah, absolutely. Lows. I mean, people will tell you that I am very negative about the work we do, which is true. I mean, I at the top level, I'm like, yeah, we make good games. I have lots of evidence that people like them. And yet when I'm working on them, that's not true. I can see the things that are good about them and I can talk about them as well, but I can see lots of things that aren't good about them, and where they could be better. And so I have a fairly negative outlook on the things we're working on typically. And so, lows.
About COVID and before the interview and trying to ship Ghost with COVID.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, COVID hit while we were just about done with Ghost. So we were like 3 months away from wrapping up when suddenly the whole company had to shut down and we had to like pivot. That the thing though, that one's not really a low because it was terrifying. You're like, how are we going to do this? We've never done anything like this. But it was a miracle, and Brian and the IT guys sorted it out, and magically we didn't lose hardly any time at all, and we managed to ship this game. It was so that feels like a movie, right? Where it, like you get this like there's an incident at the beginning that suddenly everything's in chaos, and how could we ever possibly succeed? And that somehow we did, right? So it's like you can't call that a low because. Yeah. Like we had, so let me give you a recent low. So we spent, after we shipped Second Son, we wanted to do a new IP, right? Because that's one of the things we think we do pretty well at Sucker Punch is we're going to develop new ideas for games. We don't just build the same thing over and over again. And so we've done it 3 times. I'm not going to count Rocket, but we've done it 3 times, right? Sly Cooper, Infamous, Ghost of Tsushima. We've done it. And we know we can do it. And we know that actually, again, get back to my core motivation, it's adding more value to what we do if we're creating new things for people, because people like new things as long as they're good. And we knew we wanted to do something new after Infamous. We'd been working on it for quite a while. So I was part of the process of defining what we were going to do next. And we spent a year and 15 months maybe working on things that we ended up canceling, walking away from. And that's a low, right? Because it's like, I clearly didn't do my job very well. If at the end of this, we're not doing any of the things that we've worked on over the last 15 months. You can actually find this on YouTube. If you look hard enough, you can find the vertical slice video of the game we didn't make so that we could make Ghost. Someone posted it on LinkedIn at some point, not realizing that was really not a good idea, but you can find it. It's on YouTube. I'm not going to tell you how. You're going to have to work for it, but you can absolutely find it.
You need my team, they're expert finders.
Yeah, probably find it. And you can see what we decided not to do. And that's kind of a low, right? Like we spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money making a lot of things that we ended up deciding we weren't going to do. I think it's so this like the us deciding not to do it though is kind of a fun story, right? Because we've been working on it for a while. We were getting close to the point where we were going to actually commit to building this. So this game is another kind of like a open world game, but more of a city kind of fantasy ish, but sort of grounded fantasy, but in a city. And we were getting close to the point where we were really going to crank up and build it. But we at the kind of the exec level at Sucker Punch, so like me, Brian, the other studio head at the time, Nate Fox, our creative director, I'm like, this game, we can absolutely build this game. It's going to be a fine game. It's going to be a B+ game. And we're not here to make B+ games. We're here to try to make Game of the Year, right? And we don't think we can turn this game into Game of the Year. It's not good enough. So we thought about what we wanted to do instead. We kind of went back to basics in terms of the sort of open world games we do. We kind of realized that the game concept we had was too complicated. We needed to simplify it down to a more kind of digestible core user fantasy, player fantasy. We talked about some. We decided that actually samurai-ish story was underexplored, at least in Western games. We kind of hit on this idea of you were the first ninja. It was a ninja game and a samurai game. We never say ninja, by the way, never say that, but that's what it was. And then we kind of worked up a proposal for it. And so when our management tree came to Sucker Punch to see the vertical slice, we prefaced it. This is a really long setup for this. I hope the story works out okay. We prefaced it by saying, okay, we're going to show you what we've been working on for the last year or so. It's going to look good, but we don't want to build it. But we spent so much making this, we feel like we have to show you. But afterwards, we're going to tell you what we want to build instead. And so we did. We ran the video. We sat down, and it was, Grady Hunt and Connie Booth, Scott Rohde, our kind of managers, looked at it, and they turned and looked at us, and Scott said, "That looks pretty good." And we're like, "Yes." And then we launched into the proposal for Ghost. Here's what we want to do instead. And we'll tell you why we want to do this instead, but here's what we want to do instead. And God bless those guys, and God bless Sony. They were like, "Okay, we trust you. We can see that we believe you. We believe that you believe, at least, that the game you're talking about building, Ghost, wasn't called Ghost at that point. It was called like an Untitled Samurai game or whatever. It may have been called Ghost, actually. Might have been called Ghost. Whatever. This has more potential. And yes, it's okay for you to basically throw away what you've done, reuse some parts of it, and build it again, build something new." And it worked out for everybody, right? Like, it was a much better game that we built. It was much more successful. Everybody looks like geniuses at the end of it. But it really took some, guts for those guys to write down the investment that they'd already put into this other concept, right, and decide, yeah, no, that's not Sony. It's not PlayStation Studios. We're not here to make B+ games. We're here to make A+ games. So if you think this tops out at B+, we probably should reboot. So it was kind of a low moment to be there and be like, oh yeah, man, we've wasted a lot of effort, time, and blood, sweat, and tears have gone into this, and we're going to walk away from it. But at the same time, it's a story that ends well, right? And that's just maybe a sign of our good fortune at Sucker Punch, right? That all of our low points have been followed by eventual successes, right? Got lots of second act turns that turned into kind of a rousing finale. So
most products, I mean, maybe you created and it's just it, but I think a lot of success stories are like this. You don't make what you intended to make, and you have some twists and turns and things go wrong. But in the end, it works out.
Yeah, you hope so. Or you're not around. You're not around to tell the story, right?
Well, but if you had shipped that game, you wouldn't have, and it wouldn't have had the success it did. So
no, it wouldn't have. It would have been fine. It would have been fine. We would have. I'm sure it would have been a game people liked, but Ghost of Tsushima is definitely the best game we've made. In terms of, it's epic and people really love it. So it's our high point so far. So I hope that the one we're working on now becomes the new high point. That's the goal, right? Always have to be better. So
can't wait to hear more. I have one last question before I ask. I want to point people to your website at suckerpunch.com. The last question is a little hard, maybe. I'm sure you've had a lot of advice in your life, but is there any?
No, you're misunderstanding my personality. Like, nobody can tell me anything. So.
Okay, okay, let me rephrase. I'm sure people have given you advice, whether you have taken it or not is a different story. But is there any piece of advice, whether you listened to it at the time or later, that has really stuck with you in your career?
Oh no, actually no. I honestly, I'm broken in this way. Like, nobody can tell me anything. So people will tell, and like anybody who knows me knows not to tell me anything, right? So, have there been things people suggested that I later was like, oh yeah, they were right. Yeah, but honestly, my brain doesn't work this way. I don't remember any of this stuff. I'm much better at remembering the advice I give other people, and seeing whether that works out or not. But in terms of, like, most people are smart enough not to give me advice, because I'm really bad at taking it. I'm horribly uncoachable. It's just not good.
You're just an entrepreneur. That's every entrepreneur. And I'm entrepreneurs that I have to lead. And everybody is this way. And everybody is such a pain.
I guess it's one of the challenges, right? Is like, it takes a certain level of arrogance to decide you're going to start your own company, right? And so that's healthy to some extent, right? As long as you're aware of it. But the people that join startups aren't the same as the people who start startups, right? And so figuring out as an entrepreneur, how are you going to realize this and bridge that gap and build something lasting? That's the hard part, right? So,
yeah. Okay, we've been talking to Chris Zimmerman, co-founder of Sucker Punch. Chris, we didn't even talk about your book, but where can people go to learn more about you, your games, or read your book? Or
you can buy my book anywhere it's available. The book's called The Rules of Programming: How to Write Better Code. It's basically a distillation of all the things that we teach new programmers at Sucker Punch. So if you're someone who's relatively new in your career, it's a useful book to read. I mean, you'll probably violently disagree with a couple things in the book, and that's okay. But it'll give you some things to think about. So if you're like a 23-year-old or a 22-year-old first programming job, or maybe you're getting to the end of your college career and you're trying to figure out what it's going to be like to actually work somewhere, or how can you bridge the gap from doing the sort of academic stuff that you do when you're in college to the sorts of things that you'll do as a professional programmer. Looks useful. It gives you a bunch of different, easy to remember rules to keep in mind as you're going about the work you're doing. It's kind of fun to write, and people like it when they read it usually. So it's good. You can buy it anywhere. It's on Amazon or whatever. So, and I don't know. It's a book of advice for young programmers, and it's what we teach to young programmers here, and it tends to be pretty successful. So.
Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lizzie. This was fun.
Thanks so much for listening to the show this week. To catch all the latest from Here's Waldo, you can follow us on LinkedIn. Be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. We'll see you next time.